Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Field Gemology Talks. Uh, Thanks for being here. We're at a special time today to accommodate our guest in Australia. Our normal time doesn't really work for the Australian time zone, so we decided to do another early one today so that we could make everybody happy. So thanks for you guys for being here. And if you had to wake up early, or if you only got 2 hours of sleep, thanks for your sacrifice. So today we're going to be talking to Terry Coldham about all things Australian sapphires. Terry has a huge experience, as he's going to tell us, with the sapphires from Australia. And so, yeah, it's a real treat to have him here today. Um, Vincent, if you're here, come on in, and maybe you can give Terry a more formal introduction with your history. Good morning. How are you?
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm awake. This is our
Okay,
earliest one so far, so that's
yeah,
that's different.
yeah, that will be interesting. We'll see. But I think next week will be about the same because our guest will be somewhere in the middle of the Pacific. So I think we have to get used to have this Field Gemology Talk a bit in the morning.
Okay, so be
So
it.
how many people are coming today?
Uh, I didn't check the numbers. We have about 30 in here right now, and more are coming every moment.
Okay,
So yeah,
okay, because I think Europe will be dead.
yeah. This
There
time,
will be Europe 3 o'clock in the morning. I think I'm not very optimistic for people in Europe.
yeah, but
But okay, it will be recorded on YouTube, so people will be able to see it later.
exactly.
So, yeah, today we are going to. We decided to invite an old friend, somebody I learn a lot from, and this is Terry Coldham. Terry Coldham is probably the most one of the most knowledgeable expert on sapphire from Australia, at least from the trade side, because he's mainly a gem merchant. You have also some very knowledgeable geologists because you have some very good geology university in Australia. But regarding the whole culture about the sapphire industry, Terry is a true veteran of this industry because he started in the 1960s before everything to boom. So he witnessed the whole craziness of the boom of the Australian sapphire. And then he saw also, when the crisis, Asian crisis happened in the 1990s, he saw also, the fall.
Mm,
And he has some great insight about, how this industry and the mining and everything, and how everything collapsed and how some people were able to survive. So I had 2 trips in Australia with Terry in 2012 and 2015 for nearly 3 weeks. And it was a great learning experience because we were together in the car and we had nothing else to do than speaking to each other. So I really learned a lot with Terry. We had a lot of interesting discussion. And I was thinking that, let's continue that, on this webinar. So maybe some people who are at home and who don't really know what to do because of this crazy situation will be happy to learn a little bit from Master Terry. So Master Terry, if you are somewhere here, maybe you can join.
okay, there he is. Welcome, Terry.
Morning or
Yeah.
afternoon, depending on where you are, I guess, or evening.
Is
Hi,
it
everybody.
is it afternoon for you now already?
Just, yes,
Oh, okay.
5 minutes into the afternoon.
Well, thanks for
Okay.
being here.
So you're at home in near Sydney, correct?
Yep, home in Sydney. That's correct.
So Terry, how do you want us to start with that? Should I show maybe you want to introduce yourself, or should I show first, the video we had after our last expedition? Up to you. Tell me
Oh,
what you would
the
prefer.
video would be good, I think. Yeah, let's watch
Okay.
the video.
Okay.
It's a good introduction to what we're going to be talking about for today.
Yeah.
So I will share my screen and then I will let you know. Okay. So you can find the video. You can go on our internet, you go on a GA website and you find this article about seeking the legacy of Australian sapphire. You scroll down a little bit and then you will find this video.
We're the only company mining sapphires that uses this log washing technique to break the clay up.
25 to 30 years I've been working on mines here.
Jack's a bit happy with the wash today.
Probably this is one of the largest sapphire washing plants currently in operation in the world. This technique, this jig, was developed here in the 1960s, this machine. And now you can see this machine everywhere around the world where you have sapphire mining.
There's about 1,000 kilos. From that, we expect to get 4 kilos of sapphire. If it's good, a lot of times less.
This separates the sapphire from the rest of the material, mainly ironstone.
What made you think of implementing this process?
We've been in the industry now for over 50 years, my father has. So it's been a matter of trial and error.
Searching the tailings, and I've had some great fun.
No one's ever found a source, actually where the sapphires come from.
According to the owner, you find sapphire in the topsoil as well here.
I don't need to sell them.
Pleasure to come here.
This is the Capricorn Sapphire mining project that belongs to Richland Resources. On the top you've got a bin, which is about a 30-ton bin.
The trommel takes out the oversize. Anything that's bigger than 25 mil is discarded.
Reminding some good time?
Yeah, it does bring back a few memories, that's for sure.
Quick lunch because we have an appointment at 2 o'clock.
United States, America, New Zealand, you name it.
See, it's all been mined, everything.
A gentleman came up with this invention.
Some days are better. We've had probably up to 300 carats.
Compared to in general, they don't need a lot of water to work here.
Designed as a one-man operation.
You find sapphires where you just don't expect to find them. I need to see what's happening with the mining plant up on top.
So the whole operation is very, very impressive for a single person to be able to master all the different elements from the mine to the market.
One of the directors of a company that's exploiting the lava plains gemfield in North Queensland.
There's a lot of plant and equipment left. Some of it's on the surface, clearly visible. Others are buried, partially buried, small, sharp, rusty edges up. If you cut yourself on those, if you haven't had a tetanus injection, you will need one.
This is my prospectus. I have a 10 billion prospectus working for me. Many people are using ants in order to see what is under without to have to dig. The pictures here is of material that we recovered here last year and cut in Thailand in March this year.
The industry has changed a lot in 50 years.
The Thais started coming in. That had an enormous influence.
And the Thais like it.
The Thais knew exactly what they were doing though.
They're full of sapphire.
You might see green, I might see blue. You find a yellow, it turns yellow. You find a green, it cuts green. But a really special blue, a soft blue with a little bit of silk. It really makes your day, and that's what you're looking for every day.
Cool. Saw some familiar faces in there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Now it was truly a great expedition, and what was even greater is that we did that twice. Thanks to Terry, thanks to your help, because you took basically each time 20 days of your time, to help me to go around on a collect sample for the GA reference collection. That was great.
Well, actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think you were planning to come out here to Australia once again around about this time, but things have changed.
Well, I was planning indeed to come again in Australia, because what I did for the two previous time, I went to collect sample for GA, but now I need to collect more sample because the one at GA, I cannot access them anymore. I need more.
Well,
and I know the place and I know the stone, so I know exactly what I want to do with them.
And I noticed Victoria in that video too, so she better bring Justin with her when she next comes.
Yeah.
Have you been here, Justin?
No, I'm planning to come in September if the travel ban allows.
Oh, that's right. You mentioned that, yeah.
So we'll see.
Well,
so Terry, can you briefly introduce yourself, for the people in the attendance? Tell a bit your background.
Yes. My name's Terry Coldham. I've been involved in gemstones on and off since I was a young boy. Not that my family had anything to do with it, but I started collecting at a very young age. I still have my first little gem and mineral collection from when I was 8 years old, which I actually bought myself from a neighbour down the road whose husband had passed away and he was a keen collector. So that's what got me started, I guess. I used to go looking for crystals and things in the creeks and around our area. And then later on, I actually did something a bit unusual. I managed to study geology as a subject at school. I don't know about the rest of the world, but to do a subject, geology as a subject in a school curriculum in Australia is very, very unusual. But I was lucky I went to a school that did that. I was also lucky in a friend of mine, my father was a gem cutter. He used to cut as a hobby, partly as a hobby, partly out of interest. A chap by the name of Reg Coote, who taught me faceting when I was about 16 years old. So that got me well and truly enthused into the industry. I finished my university, my schooling, and I wanted to go to university and study geology, but my grades weren't good enough in those days to do geology as a science degree. So I started as a jeweler's apprentice of all things. And after about 3 months, I reckon, and I nearly lost a platinum bar in the Lemel box, my boss at the time said, "Hey, Terry, you'll never be any good as a jeweller. Get one of these. And he showed me a gemology diploma, a diploma of gemology from the Gemological Association of Australia. I enrolled, did that, and through contacts in the Gemological Association, I very quickly got a job with a guy by the name of Aubrey Rouse from a company called Pan Pacific Products. And an amazing introduction to Australian sapphire, because Aubrey was one of the very first large-scale buyers of rough sapphire on the fields of Glen Innes and Beryllium. This was well before there were any Thai visitors coming to Australia. My job was to weigh the rough sapphire with a big set of brass scales, and the miners would queue up. They'd have to make an appointment to sell to us. They would queue up outside and wait, and each one would bring in their parcel. And one of the syndicates, the Registon Creek Syndicate, was actually Jack Wilson's father, who Jack now got the large-scale sapphire mine that was in the video that you just saw. Jack used to come in. He was a little bit younger than me. I was about 18 or 19 at the time, and Jack was a little bit younger than me. And we've known each other all that time. So anyway, the miners used to bring the rough in. We would grade it out into a multiplicity of different grades. Anything with silk in it was delegated to low grade, third quality, no matter how clean and good looking it was. And the Aubrey had grades ranging from perfect firsts, which were fine, clear, coloured stone, right through to what he called corundum. I do have a slide on that aspect of my career. Here we go. Sorry.
No, no problem.
Fiddling around here.
It's interesting that you started as a cutter. But
Sorry?
I say it's interesting that you started as a cutter, because I think that, especially nowadays, I guess that Justin, you will agree, but probably the best thing you can do if you want to start something in the gem trade, besides getting a gemology diploma, is learning how to cut, because at least you can look at a stone and decide to recut, and you can see the potential of a stone when you know a bit about cutting.
Yeah. It's
Yeah. Do you get that image now?
Yep.
Yeah, we can see. Okay.
Okay. So this was what you were just talking about. I think, Vincent, I agree 100%. I found that short period of cutting, I did do a bit of cutting later on, but I'd finished cutting by the time I was in my 20s, because I just didn't really enjoy the actual cutting myself. It wasn't something that I found good to do. But as far as being able to read rough, it put me in good stead for the rest of my career. And I think that's something that's extremely important. If you're going to be buying rough, you really need to know how to have had experience in cutting first. So here we are. This is this syndicate price sellers prices back in 1967. On the right there's a picture of the gentleman on the right, is a chap under Barry Gartrell, who was one of the very early buyers. And my boss used to call him one of the Queensland Cowboys, because he was in competition. Barry was buying on the Queensland fields in an entirely different way to what Aubrey was buying on the Inverell Glen Innes fields. But you can see average size of 85 per ounce, first quality, $60 Australian per ounce. The largest, best grade he had there was absolutely top world market prices offered for large special stones. So there you go. I'll go back to...
Was he checking out rough in a three-piece suit? He looked really sharp in that picture.
Well, yes, I'll go into a little bit of the history of the early buyers of Australian sapphire shortly, but in the meantime, I'll continue with my story, I guess. Mm-hmm. So I worked with Pan Pacific Products for 3 years. During that time, every second week, twice a month, we would fly up to the Inverell Glen Innes sapphire fields, and buy the rough off the miners. And then in the alternate weeks, my job was to go out and sell the cut stone. A few things started to sort of click with me. Firstly, I'd done my degree in geology. Not my degree, I'd done my course in geology at uni, at school, and something didn't ring true about this idea of these stones being a result of being water-worn. And what made me wonder about that was that a chap by the name of Ollie Chalmers, who was the curator of minerals at the Australian Museum, wrote a book about Australian gemstones, and he said, these are water-worn sapphires that have been encased in the basalt as the basalt flowed down the river streams and picked up these pebbles of sapphire. Well, that didn't make sense at all because it didn't seem to pick up anything else. It just picked up the sapphires and zircons and spinels. So anyway, I started questioning a few things, but more particularly, I was very intrigued because at that stage, Aubrey was sending his rough over to a company called Isaac Brothers in London for cutting and processing, and then they would send back some of the cut stones for us to sell in the Australian market. And on alternate weeks, that was my job, to sell the cut stone to the jewellers around Australia. But the curious thing was that when these stones came back from Isaac, they never had any silk in them. And from my experience in cutting, I knew that most of the rough that we were sending would be silky after it was cut. So that greatly intrigued me for quite a long time. But anyway, I finally I left Pan Pacific Products, and I had the chance then to attend Macquarie University to do a degree in geology, which I did. I did mineralogy and petrology, and I scraped through with a pass. But prior to that, whilst with Pan Pacific, I forgot to mention, I gained my gemology diploma in 1967. I think I became a gemologist. And excuse me, it was quite interesting to go to university and do mineralogy and petrology after doing a gemology degree, because my tutors would say to me, hey, have a look at this thin section, tell me what the stones are. And I just look and say, oh, that's tourmaline, or that's sphene. And they say, how can you possibly know that without doing all the tests and optical properties and so forth? But of course, I handled hand specimens of these stones, and I'd only ever seen them in thin sections and rocks. So I finished my degree in geology, and that coincided with the end of a mining boom in Australia. But fortunately, I had a holiday job of working with a sapphire mining company, grading and sorting their rough sapphire. I didn't realise it at the time, but I probably knew as much about rough sapphire as pretty much anybody in Australia through working with Aubrey Rouse and Pan Pacific Products. And also by this time, my father had decided to invest in a sapphire mine up at Beryllium. He did this because he knew I was interested in sapphires, and his friend Reg Coote, the guy that taught me faceting, talked him into financing his sapphire mine. So it was through that I first met a Thai sapphire buyer by the name of Ampan Jarugason. And Ampan was a young breed of gem dealers at that stage in Bangkok. Now, Ampan had his 21st birthday party along with my 21st birthday party. So that's in 1976, isn't it? No, 1967. So we go back a long time. And he's now passed away. But what enabled me to do, of course, was to get a very early introduction to what was happening in the sapphire industry. And probably one of the first things I learned from Ampan was that they heat treated the sapphire. And after doing my degree in geology and thinking about exsolution and things like that, it suddenly dawned on me, of course, if you heat them up to a certain temperature, the silk goes back into solid solution, it's trapped there if you cool it relatively rapidly. And bingo, you've got clear stones. So that started me in my... I then started working for a sapphire mining company called Dominion Mining, which are the biggest miners in Australia for a long time. And I managed to talk them into starting up a cutting factory in Bangkok to process their production, to try and get some more of the ongoing profitability of the stones. People like King Star and so forth really, really hated this. They just did not want us in Thailand at all. However, through Umpan, we did start up a cutting factory, and we just started to get going. We had about 30 cutters working for us at that time on Tombre's side. And unfortunately, there was a crash in the market, the share market in Australia. And I got a directive from my directors in Sydney, sell everything, get out of there, and bring the money back. So I did. And there was a bit of a fire sale, which the Thai people thought was great because we had quite a lot of rough and so forth. And that was the end of my actual time working in Bangkok. That was quite a long time back now, and I was only there for 18 months. So back to Australia, and I got involved in various aspects of the gemstone business. And finally, I started my own wholesale gemstone company and jewellery company and so forth in Australia. Yeah. That do for a starter?
It's a good way to begin. That's a long journey already. So
sorry about that.
No, it's okay. The thing that I'm sort of immediately curious about is, we in the video and in your story already, we've already mentioned the Thailand and the Thai traders several times. So maybe we can just talk about that a little bit, because I don't know anything about the relationship between the Thai gem industry and the Australian gem industry. How did this all come about? When did the Thai buyers start going to Australia and working with the miners of the Australian miners?
Okay. Even for me, it's a little vague at the very beginnings of what happened. That chap, Barry Gartrell, that I mentioned earlier, and another guy were buying rough in Australia, and in those times there was very few miners around, and selling it to people in Thailand. So there was Australian rough starting to go to Thailand. Companies like the one I was working for, Pan Pacific, who were selling their rough overseas, started to find that they were being nudged out of the business because people like Barry Gartrell and others were buying bigger lots, quicker lots, and happy to do so. And then, of course, the inevitable happened, and one of their customers, and it was actually King Star, Chung Kung, came to Australia and started buying himself. Why buy off these Australians if I can go to the mines myself? He did that. And that appears to have coincided with the story of the time that the Thai industry started heat treating Australian sapphire. And there's some good reasons as to how that all happened. We might go into that later on. But it had to be the fact that the Thai industry discovered a method of clarifying the stones, basically, is all they were doing. They also had already a cutting industry through the Thai ruby and some Cambodian sapphire and so forth, and they had the experience, and also they had overseas international buyers that were interested in the sapphire and ruby. So at that stage, that's when I first went to visit Chantaburi way back then. There was essentially only 3 products in Chantaburi at that time. One was Thai or Cambodian ruby, one was Palin sapphire, and the other was Australian sapphire. And the Australian sapphire way by a long, long way, as you'll see later on. I'll give you a few statistics about that. So that caused an influx of buyers into Australia.
I know the story about the beginning of the interest of the Thai in Australia, actually, and why people from Canterbury went to Australia to buy stone. When you remember, Terry, you were not there, but when we went to a lava plain, and we discussed with some people in lava plain about how the Thai came in lava plain because they had a sapphire mine in lava plain for about 25 years. The government didn't know about. So when I ask about how this all started, they say that it started with Thai fishermen. In Canterbury, people are mining stone and doing things with stone, but they are also fishing, and especially shrimps. So you had some Thai fishermen who went on the coast in Australia, and they were in cairns in order to resupply. And then you had some people from the inside who went also in the same town, and they started to discuss. And some of them bring some sapphires. And the guy from the fisherman boat, Thai fisherman boat, returned in Thailand with the sapphires, and then told the people there that you had sapphires. So then other people, Thai dealers, started to come in thing. And it seems that these Thai buyers knew about how to make business. They learned how to make business, overseas, because in their family, they were also involved in the fishing. And fishing in Thailand was quite already an international business for many years. So they knew how to send money abroad, how to make payment in order to resupply the ship. So they had already a network that was existing in Australia about the fishing industry. So it seems that there was a connection between the fishing industry and the gemstone industry, at least at the beginning in the 1970s. That's what I
haven't heard that story before, and I feel it's probably a little bit romanticized, a little bit far-fetched in many ways.
Yeah, that's possible.
Anything's possible in this world, but the way I saw it was that this proliferation of buyers in Australia from Thailand occurred as a matter of course because of the wonderful profits that were being made of the material, so more and more guys. So as you can see by this slide, I think you can see it there, can you?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is, I'll read the text. The most unusual dwellings in the garden-sized sheds, buying houses used by the resident Thai buyers, representing the big Bangkok gem houses. They bargain hard, pay cash, and unlike the selective gem merchants from Sydney gem merchants, are prepared to buy unsorted parcels of gems by the plastic bucketful. I don't think these people had any connections with the fishing industry. They may have, because a lot of these people that came out in those days were actually the very much the younger generation. And it's their parents, mostly Chinese-born successful businessmen or even unsuccessful businessmen in Thailand that sponsored and helped them. Where their story does ring a bell in some respects is the mention of being able to move money around. And this was a very interesting aspect of this whole industry because actually at that stage, you couldn't just send over large volumes of money out of Thailand. You had to have an alternative way of doing it. And there was a money merchant based in Singapore. He was Thai, but based in Singapore. And he handled these funds that were coming into Australia to buy the rough and probably various other things too for many, many years. And in fact, even when the Thais went to Sri Lanka and started buying big time, exactly the same company, same situation where any funds that were transferred from Thailand to Sri Lanka had to be done through the back route, so to speak. Mm. And maybe that aspect of it, the ability to be able to send funds around the world to buy these rough sapphires, came from similar situation with the fishing industry.
It's
I heard the
interesting.
same story also in relation with Sri Lanka, with Beryllium. You know, the gem merchants in Sri Lanka are also, you know, Beryllium is a fishing port, Gal is a fishing port. So why the Sri Lankan, you know, are all around Africa, especially Mozambique, Madagascar? Yeah, they know about international trade because of the fishing industry. This is what I heard also from there. So the fact that Chantaburi and Beryllium and Gal are all, you know, on the coast, and there is a fishing industry, so it means that there is a culture about international business, you know, help for these people to be able to go out from their country and to be very successful international buyers. Maybe it's not the same people, but they learn from each other, you know, in the same small town.
Could be, certainly could be. But I think it's probably a little bit of a tenuous connection, especially when you consider the Australian sapphire mines were all well and truly inland. About the only fishing I ever saw up at Glennis and Beryllium was trout fishing, which I thoroughly enjoyed up there. Anyway, that's another story. So, where do you want to take it from here?
Well, maybe you can introduce a little bit, tell us a little bit about the different type of sapphire deposit you have in Australia, and explain a little bit the setting in Australia about sapphires. Because there are several deposits in Australia. There are quite a kind of diversity of sapphire and sapphire deposit.
Okay. I'm not getting very good at this, but I hope I'll get better.
No, you are doing good so far. Go on.
So this is my typical Australian sapphire.
Yeah.
Straight out of the ground like that. I love it.
It's interesting because Gemfield has the same thing, but with a ruby on a map of Africa. They have a ruby with the shape of Africa. You have a sapphire with the shape of Australia. That's cool.
You've got to find one sooner or later if you see enough rough. So the main thing about the Australian sapphire is it's coming out of basalt associated with volcanism, tertiary volcanism. This map here shows you in red the post-Cretaceous basalts or tertiary basalts throughout Australia. And you'll see they extend from up north of Townsville, in fact, up a place called Cooktown, right up here in this area, right through to Tasmania. There's two main fields, and that is the New England fields. They were the earliest fields. Oh, no, they weren't. I'm sorry. Why does it do that? The Queensland sapphire fields were the very first to be started, then the New England fields. They're the two main production fields. Other areas where you found sapphire that have never really amounted to commercial deposits in this area to the north of, to east of Sydney in Oberon, up Lava Plains, which Vincent mentioned before. There's some sapphire mining operations trying to work there. And of course, where Chris is working down in Tasmania.
Yep.
So in all cases, the sapphire is found mostly in alluvial river deposits or what appear to be alluvial deposits associated with tertiary volcanism. The general accepted theory is that these result from subduction of the ocean crust spreading and going down underneath the continental crust. And you get weaknesses, excuse me, and magma start to form in this area, and then they use weaknesses to come up as volcanoes through the continental crust. This is a schematic drawing of a volcano. So you have your magma down the bottom, the magma chamber, and being a fluid, it tends to rise as molten material goes up to the surface through flaws and cracks. On the way, there's several potential possibilities as to where the sapphires came from. They could be in corundum-forming lenses down the lower crust, upper mantle area, or in middle crust areas of metamorphism of sediments, or even right up in the upper crust where you do find some, in some places such as Broken Hill, and in Sri Lanka, Broken Hill is the Corundum-bearing pegmatites. Still a lot of work being done on exactly where the magma picks up the sapphires. But the main thing to think about is the fact that the magma coming up through the volcano acts like a fluid elevator, and it takes these particles of corundum up with it. So if you've got corundum, say, in a gneiss or a pegmatite, or in these rocks down here, sapphire and the associated minerals such as zircon and spinel, highly refractory minerals, so they take a lot of temperature. Whereas most of the other materials around them, surrounding the feldspars and so forth, are less likely to survive this journey in this fluid elevator. So by the time you get up to the top, you have molten magma coming out as lava flows. And in those lava flows, very, very rarely we find the occasional corundum xenocryst. That xenocryst means a strange crystal. Xenoliths or xenocrysts. It should be xenocryst, not xenoliths. That's incorrect. It's xenocrysts. And they're weathered out of the presumption was they were weathered out of the basalt and collect because of the high Pacific gravity in the local creeks and rivers. I'm of the opinion nowadays that it's much more likely that most of the sapphire we see in these alluvial deposits stem from the pyroclastic phase of the volcanism. That's the gaseous phase with a lot of particle materials being blown out by the volcano and forming pyroclastic deposits. But either way, essentially that's how it's happening. And the thing that I find absolutely fascinating about this is Australia's not the only place that's got this exact scenario.
Yep.
It occurs all around the world. Even in Vincent's home country of France, but in Russia and several places in Southeast Asia, throughout the world.
Africa.
And the sapphires that come out of these, associated with this tertiary volcanism, I find fascinating because they've got the same physical and chemical properties, be they from France, or be they from Laos, or be they from Nigeria or Australia.
Yeah, all the
The only thing is that the proportions vary a bit. So, for example, you may have some areas that have more rutile in them, therefore silkier stone. Some areas may be more greener, therefore less titanium perhaps. The crystal habit may vary slightly, but essentially they're the same. And these variations we actually observe in the different fields in Australia. So the Queensland fields, for example, tend to be overall larger fragments. They tend to be more green, darker, and less silk than those from the Inverell fields. But even from one river or creek bed to another one just on the other side of the hill, you can see the differences in the corundum. So if you look at two lots of corundum, two parcels of corundum, you can say, oh, well, that one probably came from Registon Creek and that one probably came from Kings Plains Creek. However, any individual particle of corundum from a basaltic deposit, I don't care where it's from. To me, at this stage, it is almost impossible to say, is that particular particle most likely came from Nigeria or China or Australia, because they've got the same physical and chemical properties. So what really intrigues me about this is, what are we sampling down here, down in the lower area or on the way up? Because, well, whatever we're sampling must be the same throughout all the continental crusts. And it almost indicates that there's a possibility that there's a corundum-rich rock that underlies the lower crust, upper mantle area throughout the world. So there's interesting, I find fascinating geological aspects of this corundum deposit way up, way past the actual sapphire, to the sapphire's commercial values.
Yeah, that's why we call them. That's why we call them basalt-related. All basalt-related sapphire, even if it's pyroclastic, they share the same. We call them BYJ, blue, yellow, green, and the blue they all have a band in UV visible spectroscopy at around 900. That you never found as much as that in any other sapphire from more like metamorphic type deposit, like in Sri Lanka, in Burma. So there is a clear separation when, and it's easy to do for us in the lab with UV visible spectroscopy. We can clearly separate sapphires that are coming from basalt-related deposit, wherever they are in the world, and sapphires that are coming from metamorphic metasomatic type deposit. It's very clear. Now, as you say, to separate the sapphire from basalt-related deposit with each other, that's much more tricky. When exactly as you say, when you look at an individual stone, even in the lab, even with trace element analysis, we found ways where we can separate stone from one deposit with another one. But as you say, in many cases, the inclusion are quite similar. You may have, for example, the famous uranopyrochlore inclusion that were said to be the hallmark of sapphire from Thailand. You may find them in Australia. So,
well, yes, in fact, I had a very interesting personal experience with that. Like everybody, I received and enjoyed Googlin's first book, The Internal World of Gemstones, and I saw the uranium pyrochlore and the poem that was written about it and everything, and oh, fabulous. I started doing my master's on the mineralogy of Australian sapphire. Unfortunately, I never finished it. But one thing I did manage to do was to identify uranium pyrochlore in Australian sapphire.
Mm.
And I had to give a little paper, and was my first introduction to the International Gemology Conference group. And we had Dr. Googlen out here with the group, and I had to stand up in front of the audience and present my paper saying, Dr. Googlen, I'm sorry, but you are wrong. Uranium pyrochlore occurs throughout the world of BGY or basaltic type sapphires. It appears to anyway. So he took it very well, actually, but I was a bit frightened because in those days, Dr. Googlen was really the number one gemologist and authority on gemstones. And how dare one say he's wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Terry, we had one question from the audience. Alan Marshall's asking, are the sapphires exclusive to volcanic activity, or do they also occur outside of volcanic origin?
The BGY stones, or the basaltic related stones, seem to be exclusive to volcanic deposits. I don't know of anywhere that they're actually found in a rock type mined as you would mine a pegmatite or something like this. The interesting thing I find about Alan's question, maybe he's thinking about Montana, and I think we've got Warren Boyd with us here today too. I suspect that the Montana sapphire deposits may be sort of like halfway between the basaltic type deposits and the metamorphic type deposits, but I wouldn't be at all surprised that a lot of the Montana sapphire is coming out of pyroclastic material from volcanism. But
in Australia, they are all coming associated with basalt, with a volcano. But outside of Australia, like Thailand, Madagascar, Tanzania, Burma, Kashmir, they are not associated with volcanoes. They are associated with contact metamorphism and metasomatism.
Sure, that's right. Yeah,
but
it's only
Australia, I don't remember about any sapphire deposit that is not associated with volcano.
Well, we do have some, funnily enough, but they're quite rare. In the Northern Territory, in the Harts Range, there is a ruby deposit in the metamorphics there that was attempted to be mined some 30 years back. And in Western Australia, there's a lot of corundum found, a lot. Almost all of it would have been shedding from metamorphics, not from basaltic deposits. But so far, nothing of any great gem significance.
I was also wondering, just based on that, the diagram of the Earth that you just showed, for Australia, when you guys do the mining, is it only from that sort of volcanic activity, or do you ever actually go deep into the ground and try to get into that upper crust level where possibly is it too hard?
Oh, it's quite out of the question because we're talking maybe 20 or 40 kilometres down.
Okay, so
But no, there's no other. There is some underground mining in the fish, particularly at the Ruby Vale fields, where they're mining, pretty shallow sort of depths for mining. Maximum, I think, about 40 metres, but probably more like 10 or 15 metres in most cases. And there they're mining alluvial deposits or fluvial deposits that may well, in fact, be reworked pyroclastic deposits.
Okay.
But now, all the Australian sapphire always associated with basalts, and pretty much it's always mining of the alluvials associated with river and creek systems surrounding, except for lava plains where we are definitely been processing pyroclastics that are there in the position they fell in when they were deposited.
Mm. And then,
Terry, what is on the overall, what are the characteristics of the sapphire you find, for example, in around Inverell, compared to the one you have in Anaki, and compare with the one you have in a lava plain or in Tasmania? How you will? They are quite different. You know, when I see a parcel from Inverell area, I know already that it's not coming from Anaki because they don't look the same.
Okay, well, perhaps I can show you a few bit of information about Australian sapphire generally, because a lot of people have misconceptions as to what Australian sapphire is, particularly these days when there's not so much around.
There is actually a big variety. So it's...
Yeah, I'll show you.
Coming from associated with volcano, but, you know, they are quite different from one deposit to another one.
Okay, so this is the range of Australian cut sapphire or colours. Yep. Pretty much, there are a few others, but pretty much you do get some very rare pinks and even the odd ruby, but essentially this is the major thing. The interesting thing is, though, that probably 80 or 90% of all the rough sapphire comes in a range of colours from here to here.
The blue and green.
In the blue tones. So the greens, the yellows and the golds are much rarer, and the party stones. And so this is the commercial range of Australian sapphire.
It's a pretty big range.
It is a good range. But
blue, BYJ, blue, yellow, green.
Yep.
Blue, yellow, green. That's why. Now, the orange one are super rare. That some people in Madagascar call Fanta. Fanta color, the orange one at the end. But they are classified as yellow. But that's a super rare one, I think at the end. Yeah.
Sorry.
For example, around Inverell, you don't have too much yellow and green. They are mostly blue. When
That's
in
right.
Anaki, you have a much larger percentage of yellow and green.
Okay, Anaki. Here we go. Bit of history and bit of colour and combined. So this is a report by a chap by the name of Dunstan. And note the date, 1902. So it's a very early report for anything on sapphires. And he's done drawings, as you can see, of his observations of the different things. And I find this really fascinating because here, for example, you've got the trapezie-like grunds, which is so common here. The colour banding. This one I find very intriguing. It's a little orange centre in the crystal. Extremely rare. We hardly ever get them. A whitish looking stone, perhaps a light silky stone similar to Gouda. So a yellow crystal. And of course, these cut stones that he's done drawings of, showing the color range. The bottom picture here are pictures of all Australian sapphires, including this incredible orange red. And these are all come from Peter Brown at Anarchy, as Vincent's mentioned him. And they show a good range of the Queensland sapphires. So as you just said, Vincent, generally speaking, Queensland is the place for more greens and yellows, bigger yellows. We don't get so many bigger yellows and so forth at Inverell, but they can occur.
So Inverell is probably about 98% blue. And
yes.
Or more. And Anarchy is more like mix.
Yes.
Lava Plain is also mainly blue. There is nearly no yellow or green, very few. While in Tasmania, it's a little bit like Anarchy. It's a whole range, you know, from yellow to green to blue to black star, milky stone. Yeah.
Generally speaking, each field has got different characteristics.
Yeah.
And not only each field, but various parts of each field have got different characteristics, all on the same theme. For example, those stones at the top of the slide you see here, very large sapphires from Queensland. I've never seen anything that large from Inverell, Glen Innes area. However, what I've observed over my years is that, generally speaking, the bluer the material that you get on any one locality, and I'm talking about individual stones, but say a parcel of stones or a group of stones, the bluer they are, the more pure blue they are, of course, indicates there's less iron present, therefore you tend to get less greens. And you don't get as many yellows, but when you do get them, they're more pale yellows. But the other interesting thing I've found over my years of looking at these stones is that the more pure the blue material, usually the overall size is smaller, and usually you get a few more pinks associated with them. So when you go to lava plains, you're getting a more pure blue colour.
Yeah.
You're getting less yellows and greens, very few. You're getting more pinks, and the overall size, particle size for a mine run is much smaller than Inverell. Inverell, for example, there's a mine, or there's an area called Redstone Creek, which Vincent's been to. It's purported to have the best blues. Just across the range from Redstone Creek, about 10 kilometres away, you've got Kings Plains, and there the stone is much darker. So if you just go outside Australia, for example, and we go to Laos and have a look at the stone that was produced in Laos, again, it tends to be more blue, smaller, and I don't know about pinks.
Same in
If you go to Nigeria...
In Pailin, they are small and blue.
Yes, Pailin.
They are small and blue. They are very blue and small, but just on the other side of the border in Chantaburi, around Kauplowen, you have stone 100 carat, 120 carat, blue, yellow, green, big one.
Yeah. We can talk for hours on it, but it's just that if people could understand the range of colours. And your mention of Pailin is very interesting, because one of the major things that happened when the Thai buyers first started working with Australian sapphire and processing it and selling it to the international buyers, cutstone buyers, was, of course, a lot of it was sold as Pailin. The best colour was sold as Pailin, not as Australian. And that's one of the reasons why Australia has such a poor name in some respects. The other reason is we're pretty bloody hopeless at promoting our own product, to be perfectly frank, and I include myself in that. I'd like you to have a look at the text in this is an article I wrote in 1985, a bloody long time ago now, wasn't it? on gems and gemology, and I'm talking about colours, and I talk about what we're referring to as wattle sapphires. This is the term we use because wattle is Australia's national flower, and the mixtures of greens and yellows and golds. Anyway, I have said here, miners often collect them, and both Thai and Australian dealers give them to their wives or sell them to friends. So I find this really a fascinating aspect of gemstones general, and in particular Australian sapphire. These stones have very recently, in the last 18 months or 2 years maximum, suddenly become popular with the rest of the world. I've been trying to push these stones as being something beautiful and special since 1985. And now people are saying, oh, bicoloured sapphires, oh, party sapphires, oh, green and yellow sapphires, teal blue sapphires. So this is wonderful, but it's an interesting reflection on the way the gem industry works. And I think that it has a, okay, I took it this different way. Up till about 1979, when the heat treatment of Gouda was suddenly discovered, it was all Australian sapphire was the big thing. There was more Australian sapphire sold around the world than any other sapphire by far, in terms of weight, not in terms of value necessarily, but certainly in terms of weight and number of pieces. And that was the accepted thing. Now, Sri Lankan sapphire has been there for a long, long time, and it was still a popular stone at that stage. But it didn't see any in Thailand until they started heating. And that changed the whole aspect of the gem industry. And all of a sudden, people wanted more blue sapphires. They didn't want the darker blues of Australia. They wanted the brighter blues. But then we go one step further. When I wrote this article, I talked about heat treatment. And nobody cared less about heat treatment in those days. They really were not worried about it, not interested. Now, I can't sell a stone unless I've got a certificate. So, well, that's an exaggeration. But people are really keen to know whether a stone is treated or not. So you get these changes in people's perception of what they want in the way of a gemstone. Sorry, I digressed a bit.
No, but that's true. Heat treatment, but not exactly the way that, it is done on the Gouda. But heat treatment was ongoing in the industry, especially in Sri Lanka, for more than 1,000 years. And until the arrival of the Gouda treatment in the 1970s, there was absolutely no difference in price between a heated and unheated sapphire, so nobody cared. Yeah. So it was a common practice. It was something like cutting and polishing. It was an accepted trade practice, and there was just no difference in price. So labs were not reporting that the stone is heated or not. Reporting or not just appear because of the heat treatment technique developed by the Thais, and suddenly the quantity of blue that came. And from what I heard, that there were some buyers, end up buyer, in Europe or in America, they were at the top end, they had the best stone. And then they started to see that the people, who were their competitor but on lower quality material, suddenly had stones that were better looking than their stone. So they said, what? How come and then they understood that the stones were heated. So in order to stay on the top, they decided to pay higher price if the stone was unheated. And then slowly and slowly, the difference in price was there. And then they asked the lab to make the difference. And this became a common thing at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. But before that, nobody cared.
Well, maybe that's a good time to talk a little bit about another theory of mine, and that is that I gave a talk to the GIA alumni a few years back, and the title was Australian Sapphire, the forgotten foundation stone of the Thai gem and jewellery industry. I don't think many people in the industry these days realise that, it's my belief anyway, that what you see in Thailand now in the gem and jewelry industry was built on the back of Australian sapphire. That's how important it was, because the original buyers who started buying this material, I'll show you an example of, I'll just go through here quickly, if I may, some history for the buyers, because one thing Australia has not been able to do is process and look after their own sapphire. All we've been any good at is basically mining it, unfortunately. So here's the turn of the century in Queensland, buyers from Germany. Now, I was speaking to Constantine Wild in a program once, because his grandfather, or great-grandfather, I'm not sure which, Constantine Wild again, actually exhibited at the Sydney Trade Fair in 1902 or 1901 or something of Australian sapphire. And I was talking to Constant about this, and he said, oh, there's some Australian sapphire in our strong room. And he sent me this photo. And this is a photo of the actual material that his grandfather purchased in Australia before the turn of the century on the Queensland sapphire fields. So quite fascinating, I think.
It's crazy that they've been holding it for this long and it hasn't been cut yet. You know, more than 120 years later, and they still have the rough. Crazy.
They're Germans and they live in Ida Oberstein. I'd hate to think what's in the...
In Ida, you just have caves. You have under the house, you have like a whole room full of rough.
Here's some sapphire bias at Anarchy.
You know, one day if you mine in Ida, you will find pockets of...
So then I talked about the Australian buyers.
Yeah.
And then the Thai buyers. And this is a friend of mine. His name is Ang. He's actually my friend Ampan's brother. He's about the same age as me, actually. And that was the first time I saw a furnace in Thailand. And that was the way that they used to do it. Very simple furnace.
The condo,
that spread to Australia. And that was our first Thai furnace, as you said, with Bill Jewell. But I like the way it's gone from that in 1967, I think, to this cartoon that was in a recent Lafferty magazine. Come and get it, the sapphires are all clear. I think that's gorgeous.
Yeah.
The thing I'm pointing out here is that the Australian miners didn't even know about heat treatment for many, many, many years. And even to this day, most of them know very little about what the effects of heat treatment and how it commercially affects their product.
Mm.
This was my office back in the days of Dominion mining and sorting the rough into all sorts of different types and qualities and so forth. But the fascinating thing is we didn't really know exactly how much had changed with heat treatment. And therefore, how can one sort and grade rough if you don't know how it will react to heat treatment?
Yeah.
Then the buyers came through, as I said. So what's this all about? And this, I think, is a slide that I prepared myself from my own work many years ago. In the top row here is the silky, typical Australian sapphire. And they're sitting on a black matte background. This row here is the same stones. You can see pretty much laid out in the same manner, but sitting on the mirror. So you can see varying degrees of silk and intensity of silk and colour. This row here is after they've been heated. Just simple heating, 1650 degrees centigrade, reducing atmosphere in a coke furnace. That's all it is. Well, we don't even know exactly what the temperature was, but we presume it was around about 1650.
Mm.
After heating, you can see the stones darker, and on the mirror, definitely clearer.
Yeah. More
Now,
saturated.
have a look at this one here. It's silky, and as at that stage, this was before anybody had even thought about Gouda. But this was what I was doing. One day I get a phone call from Ampan from Bangkok. Said, Terry, they can cook the Ceylon sapphires and make them look bluer. Oh, what sort? He said, oh, the silky ones. Now, I've been to Sri Lanka several times before then. We were looking at actually mining there at one stage. And I had some silky Ceylon sapphires in my collection. And I had a crucible in my hand that I was about to put into my furnace with Australian sapphires. So I popped a few of these milky Ceylon sapphires in, put a lid on it, put it in the furnace. And when they came out blue. Not brilliant blue like you would normally expect, but enough for me to say, oh my God, this is an unbelievable thing. So I can imagine, anybody can imagine what effect it had on the buyers in Thailand. And it led to a huge number of people, buyers going to Sri Lanka. So the question is, how did the Thai people come to learn about cooking Gouda? So this is Australian sapphire. And some of these pieces here, like this, and here, are very much like Gouda. This is Gouda. It's been preformed, but this is Sri Lankan Gouda. So it doesn't take much if a Thai person's been heating Australian sapphire to look at these stones and see what they do. They would notice that for sure. There was actually even people in those days, a buyer by the name of Watna, who only purchased these sort of stones and used to pay top dollar for them. So they only had to see something from Sri Lanka that looked like this. So, oh, gosh, we better try that. And I'm sure that's what happened. The first person to doing it, and there is possibility, definite possibility, that this may well have been being done secretly and quietly in other parts of the world way before the Thais started doing it.
Yeah, I heard that also. Like you were telling, the stones that you sent to Europe, they were coming back, there was no silk anymore. Yeah.
Yeah.
I heard that.
No, but I'm talking about Gouda. I suspect Koningsschild did an article about the fluorescence in Gouda, and so did a gemologist here in Australia, Jeff Toombs, way back before 1980, 1979. But anyway, this is a sample I did in the early days, cutting them in half, and the results are spectacular.
Yeah.
This is another stone, our ring. We cut this piece off the bottom of the cabochon before we cut it. Oh, this. So these are Australian sapphires, and you can see they look like Gouda. So my theory is that after someone found how to treat Australian sapphire, and that became a big thing, that led possibly to the treatment of Gouda.
So this is the Thai, ex-Thai policeman who discovered treatment in Thailand.
There are other talks, other stories. Another story is, oh, by the way, as an aside to all this, many years later, only about 20 years ago now, I found out that the company Issacharoff Brothers that my boss was sending his rough to was in fact on sending it to Germany or Austria, I can't remember, to the Brahms, a lady by the name Madame Brahm, who's apparently been heat treating way back before the turn of the last century. And that's where the stone was being treated and then going back to Issacharoff's after being cut and then coming back to Australia, some part of it. So this treatment of Australian sapphire anyway has been going on for a long time, and quite possibly some other processes too. when I first went to Bangkok, there was no treatment of Ceylon sapphire. In fact, this photo here, I don't know if anybody recognises it, but that's Mahesuk.
That's what I was thinking. It looks the same today.
Yeah. And we just moved into this here, Nakhon Gems. And this is where we spent half our time playing cards. Why I put this photo, and this guy here, his nickname, the only name I ever knew him by was Big Dog. He was the leading guy for heat treatment in those days. And he was very open and used to tell me anything I wanted to know about heat treatment. So things have changed a lot.
Yeah.
My final point about the Thai business is this. I did a bit of a calculation. In a decade of Australian production would have produced some 297 million carats. Oops, sorry. About 29.7 cubic metres of cut Australian sapphire would have come out of Thailand at that time. That's based on the quantity of rough that was mined, the production figures from people who I knew in the industry, such as Dominion Mining and so forth. I did all their selling for many, many years, so I knew how much they produced. And then calculating back from the percentage that was any good and blah, blah, blah. So I did this for my talk in Gem A, enough to cover the Lord's cricket ground to a depth of 2 millimetres of cut Australian sapphire. Imagine how much profit was fed back into the Thai gem industry. Mm-hmm. It was just quite amazing.
Yeah. So Terry, while we're speaking about heat treatment, and this was a question that was asked a little bit ago, but I think it's still pretty relevant to what we're talking about. Alan Marshall had also asked, talking about the different colors and the inclusions and everything, talking about silk specifically, can you talk a little bit about like what is the silk? How is it affecting the appearance of the stone? And then, of course, the heat treatment that changes it?
Yes. It's pretty basic gemology these days. The silk, what we call silk, I suppose, is mostly consists of very fine, very, very fine needles of rutile. And it has a silky look to it in the cut stone or even in the rough stone. The degree of chatoyancy, and in fact, all-star sapphires are the result of this silk, rutile in the stone. It doesn't always have to be rutile. There are other forms of material that cause chatoyancy, such as ilmenite, hematite.
Ilmenite and hematite, and yeah.
But if we think of this stage at this point, just restricting our thoughts to rutile in the form of silk. It's interesting because where the silk comes from is it comes out of what we call solid solution. And this is fascinating. If you have a solution of salt, for example, in water, and you cool it, you'll reach a point where the salt will start to crystallize out in the water. And that's pretty easy to sort of understand, that the salt molecules were in solution and they weren't crystals, and then as it cooled down, they coalesced and formed crystals. But it's a little harder to imagine that the same thing happens in a solid. And what I am told, and I'm no expert, but the corundum crystals that were formed in an area that high proportion of silk or rutile or perhaps ilmenite or hematite as well. But let's look at rutile. So you can calculate out scientifically a point they call the eutectic point, where one substance dissolves in another. And the eutectic point for dissolving rutile in sapphire is around about 1450 degrees centigrade. That's presuming atmospheric pressures. And don't forget, the pressures down below are going to change that temperature parameter. But anyway, so the sapphires form and they've got an excess of rutile in them.
Yep.
And they cool and they crystallize. And then would you believe that once they go below the 1400 or the eutectic point, the rutile wants to crystallize out. And it's got a bit of a problem because it's got nowhere to go. All it can do is go between within the molecular structure of the corundum host. So it can only form very, very thin plates and along very thin lines. So you end up with very thin, very fine crystals, and you've probably all seen photos of them, depending on the type of sapphire and so forth, whether they're platelets or whether they're needles. And I know in Australian sapphire, we've done some electron microscopy on these things. And some of the silk that you can see in a hand specimen, we haven't actually been able to resolve fully under electron microscopy. It is so fine. So anyway, you take these silky stones. And as I said earlier, silk in a sapphire, of course, can be a very positive thing. Not only do you get star sapphires or due to silk, but also the classic and famous Kashmiri sapphire owes a lot of its beauty to this very slight silkiness. And people will probably laugh at me, but in fact, we do get the odd Australian sapphire, very rare, that would very closely pass that Kashmir look. Pure blue, very light silk, and absolutely beautiful. And anyway, so silk's not necessarily a bad thing, but when it occurs in bands, and you've got rather ugly chevron bands and so forth through the stone, or when it mixes up the extraordinary and the path of the ordinary rays, so you can't really see the separation of the dichroic colours. Instead of having a blue one way and a green the other way, you get a sort of an oily, greeny blue colour, which is not very attractive due to the light. Yeah, due to the light reflecting off the silk. Or you get a very dull stone that after pasting, I'm talking about pasting, sorry, after pasting, it's a very dull stone. So if you can heat the stone up past the eutectic point, bingo, the silk, the rutile goes back into the corundum, into the solid solution, probably as a molecular, not as a molecular form, but as an ionic form. In other words, instead of having titanium dioxide molecules in your corundum, you have titanium ions in your corundum. That's got another very important effect on things. But heat it up and cool it down relatively rapidly, geologically speaking, and you've got a clear stone. Now, for example, if you take a synthetic sapphire, which you dope with large quantities of titanium and heat it up and cool it down very slowly, that rutile the titanium dioxide will exsolve out and you'll get a synthetic star sapphire. So in the natural stone, that's what basically the Australian sapphire, originally anyway, was heated to clarify and to try and do that without it going any darker or any greener. So if you do it in a reducing environment, it's less likely to go green than if you do it in an oxidizing environment. The next step in this whole thing I find is a little bit more fascinating. When we used to heat the Australian sapphire, the big problem was it would go clearer, would tend to go darker as well.
Yeah.
When the Gouda came along, what happened? Yes, you cleared the stone, but you also made it bluer.
Yeah.
And it's quite likely, in fact, I'm pretty sure what is happening here is those titanium ions that you're releasing into the stone combine with whatever ions are there to give blue coloration. And in the Gouda, that's great because there wasn't any blue before or very little, and now you've got a stronger blue. And the Australian sapphire and basaltic sapphire is not so good because the sapphire becomes a bit too dark. So does that answer the question, Justin?
No, I think that was pretty a thorough answer of that question. Thanks.
I hope it's, yeah.
So basically, the good thing with heat treatment, when you look at a whole parcel of sapphire from a given mine in Australia, most of the stone are not transparent enough to be faceted to find a use in the trade. So that's why you had the dealers coming, the traditional dealers before the tide to come. They were coming and they were just picking the stone that they could facet directly. So they were very picky, and they were only selecting maybe 1% or 2% of the production. But when the tides came, they bought everything, because thanks to heat treatment, they had a way to turn maybe 60 or 70% of the stone into something that had a market.
Yeah. In fact, again, a little story. 4 years ago, I was in London.
Yeah.
And I went to a gem office and I saw a nameplate on the wall that said Issacharoff Brothers. Oh, that's the company that I, as an 18-year-old, the company that I worked for, used to sell their stone to Issacharoff Brothers. I'll go and say hello. I went in and introduced myself, and David Issacharoff, the owner, who was semi-retired, but I spoke to his kids. And I said, oh, you wouldn't have any rough left over, because they're only diamond merchants now. And they said, yes, we've got some in the safe. So they dragged it out. And there was about 16 kilos of all sorts of offcuts and things. And I said, do you want to sell it? And they said, yes. So I went through it and I offered a price for it. And this was all mostly silky stone or floored stone. And being, I think there was 3 or 4 good Jewish sons, I remember going back after making my offer, and they were arguing at the top of their head, off top of their voices. And I don't speak Yiddish, but I sort of got the feeling of some of them were saying, oh, great, it's been sitting there for 30 years, let's get rid of it and get a few dollars. And the others were saying, no, hang on a second. If he wants to spend that sort of money on it, it's got to be worth more. They were arguing as to whether it's solid or not. Anyway, I bought it. But I thought it was rather curious, because when I got the material back to Australia, the boxes that was in, and I've got some of them right here, the boxes that was in still had the labels that I'd typed when I was 18 years old.
Well, they had your label?
Before we exported, yes.
Oh, my God.
That's crazy.
Just for fun.
Back home.
30 years later, gee, that's it's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing to think that people are holding on to that, you know, instead of just heating it, cutting it, selling it, whatever. It's just still there. Same as Idar Oberstein. It just sits in the vault. I guess you have time. So.
And I think even to this day, there's a lot of material sitting in vaults and bags and so forth in Bangkok.
Yeah, I've heard that story as well. Lots of Geoda in Mahisak, all around that area, just piled up in garages and stuff. A few different people.
When I was preparing the talk about how Australian sapphire influenced the Thai gem and jewelry industry, I was very fortunate to interview a few guys. And all of them reiterated a few things. Number one, yes, definitely Australian sapphire is what gave them their start and their family starts. We're talking about companies like Beauty Gems, Xing Heng, the founder of Gemopolis, for example. He is quite clear that one of the major reasons why he started, and he was, it's a fascinating story, but I suppose I can tell it, it's open forum, but he doesn't like the story very much. It is said that Bunyong, the boss of Xing Heng and Gemopolis, was actually a driver for King Star before the Australian sapphire boom started. he's gone from there to being, the huge corporation industry that he's managed to produce. So a lot of what you see now has been financed in very early days by profits made out of Australian sapphire to a great extent, but also, of course, profits made from Palin sapphire and Thai ruby.
Yeah.
There is another thing, Terry, that there is Thai people went in Australia and they bought the stone, and through their knowledge of heat treatment, they were able to process and to sell them with profit. But what I found fascinating is that they didn't only bring back sapphires, they bring back all the technology about mining that was developed in Australia. And all, the boom of mining in Thailand, in Chantaburi Strait, when you see the machine, and when you see the machine after that in Burma, in Africa, all these machines are coming from Australia. They were developed in Australia. So they not only came back with the stone, they came back also with, this is the way that the Australians are mining, and they bring back everything home.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about how this machine were developed in Australia and how the history of the mining?
Sure. Well, it's no small coincidence that the Inverell sapphire fields were initially found because of tin mining in the near vicinity.
Yeah.
So tin being a very commercial product in the late 1800s, they found a few sapphires associated with the tin mining, and that led to a few guys, especially when there was a crash in the tin mining tin market, to mine sapphire. And of course, sapphire having a reasonably high specific gravity worked very well in what we call the tin jigs, the jigs that were used for separating up the sapphire out of the tin.
Mm-hmm.
So they adapted that equipment
from tin mining to sapphire mining.
Yeah, from tin mining to sapphire mining. So basically, it's a very simple process. You've got a rotating screen that sieves out the material coming from the mine, from the excavation.
Mm-hmm.
It's sieved and taken through to the jigs. And there's not a very good picture of the jigs here, but these are the jigs in here that actually separate out the sapphire and other minerals. And we haven't really talked much about this, but the other interesting thing is that you have these accessory minerals, these minerals that are found with sapphire, zircon, pleonase, black spinel in particular, and several others, ilmenite, and some various hornblends and so forth. But basically, those are the two main ones: is sapphire, is zircon, and spinel. And they, incidentally, are also found associated with BGY, basaltic type sapphires, all around the world. You get the same zircons in France with the sapphires as you do in, Laos, for example.
Yeah.
So that's how this system developed. The big area here is the Kings Plain sapphire field, and you can see Kings Plain sapphire mine, a Dominion Mining, and you can see it was a large operation. But the other interesting thing about this is that it's on some of the prime real estate and farming area in the whole of Australia, some of the best land in the whole of Australia. And of course, the local owners weren't too happy to have sapphire miners there. So they had to do very good restoration. And all this area here has all been mined, strip mined, restored. And it reached the point where the property owners were very happy with this because they was like doing a deep plough, and they got beautiful crops after sapphire mining. This did not seem to translate to other parts of the world where this methodology was used. And I refer to, here's Jack Wilson's mine. Actually, we can see Vincent taking a photograph there. But when was it? When the sapphire mining started in Kanchanaburi. I remember going to Borploy many, many years ago when I was there, and there was no mechanical mining, but it was a fascinating area. Then when the mechanical mining started, well, actually, I'll start the story. We got time to another quick story?
Yeah, it's okay. We don't have any problem with time.
Okay.
People come and go. And, yeah, no problem.
I'm rambling a bit now, but my friend Numpan and his associates had a tin mine up at Three Pagoda Pass.
Mm-hmm.
And there it was an illegal mine. Of course, in those days there was a tin embargo on mining. So they had this illegal mine and they had to keep the local politician on side. So they supported him in his election by providing funds and so forth for his election campaign. And he won. And he said, okay, thanks, fellas, piss off. I'm going to take your tin mine. Bang. So they put the tail between their legs and they went back to the base of one of the guys. His name was Lek, which was Kanchanaburi. And they turn up there with their excavators and so forth. And I don't know whether anybody's going to believe me or not about this, but anyway, I'll say it. They remembered when Terry had said several years earlier, gosh, if you could ever mine for sapphire, if you're ever allowed to mine for sapphires in Thailand, this is the place to do it. So the mining law had actually only recently changed, and up till then you were not allowed to use mechanical methods of mining in Thailand, but there they were. So they did a deal with one of the guys in the sugarcane field beside the road. They dug a hole, and lo and behold, they came across this incredible quantity of black spinel. It's a very nice sapphire. And that's the story I'm told, or I tell anyway, of how the sapphire mining started in Kanchanaburi. Now, the next part about this, of course, was these guys also had visited the Australian sapphire fields on many occasions, and they knew what sort of equipment to use. Lek was an engineer, and he very quickly built some of this stuff. And one of the things that I did for them, I took the first magnetic separator to Kanchanaburi from Australia. We haven't mentioned earlier, but you can separate out the sapphire from the large quantities of black spinel by magnetic separation. Black spinel has a slight magnetic susceptibility. Sapphire doesn't, so you can actually separate out the two. It's a big help. So what you saw in Kanchanaburi, again, had to some extent its origins, it owed its origins to Australian sapphire. Enough stories?
Yeah.
No, it's good. I got a few questions, Terry, that were emailed to me from before we began that I think maybe is a bit interesting. Somebody had asked. This is from Kumar. What do you think is the most unique qualities of the Australian sapphire compared to the other types of sapphire that we see around the world? You know, what separates Australia from the rest, so to speak?
Okay, two completely separate things. If you're talking about the vast bulk of Australian sapphire, the feature that it had, and still has, but there's not that much mining going on now, but why it was so popular was you can produce masses of calibrated goods, matching goods, very similar in colour and easy to match. So ideal for mass-produced manufactured jewellery. So that's one of the major reasons why Australian sapphire took off, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing, and probably more the case now, is the uniqueness of certain of its colours and sizes. And I'm finding myself personally that the greens, parties, teal blues, and that sort of colours are very, very popular. And whilst you can get a few from other countries, such as Madagascar, Nigeria, and so forth, Australia seems to be the major source. And the last but very important thing that makes Australian sapphire unique, and there's not many of them, is the incredible size and quality you can get in some stones, in the greens, and particularly the yellows and golds. Enormous, large golds, which probably rival anything anywhere else in the world. they often don't need heat treatment. I've seen green star sapphires, cabochons 60 by 30 millimeter, odd things like that.
Wow.
So, yeah.
And then another question related, are there certain inclusion types that only the Australian sapphires show? Can you use the inclusions to actually differentiate the Australian stones from the rest of the world production?
Oh, yes, definitely. The internal aspects of Australian sapphire, not only the inclusions, but the colour banding, the types of silk, all can be quite distinctive for blue GY basaltic-related sapphires. So, we talked about one uranium pyrochlore, but that's a little bit more difficult to find. But I think silk, negative crystals. What do you think, Vincent? What would you?
I think that based on the inclusion, it's very difficult to separate Australian sapphire with sapphires from other places like Thailand or South Vietnam, China, North Madagascar, Nigeria, Cameroon.
Sure.
Based on the inclusion, good luck. I don't know.
No, I think the question
in chemistry, when you start to shoot in bands of minute particles, and you have not only the information on the chemistry of the corundum, but also the information on the trace element in the particle, then we start to find a thing. And there was some work that was done by my colleague at GIA, Dr. Sang Sawang, where he was able to separate sapphire from Australia with the one from Palin, with the one from Wen, with the one from Madagascar, and the one from Nigeria and things like that. But you need trace element chemistry.
But I think the question was, can you use the inclusions to separate it from metamorphic type corundums?
From metamorphic type, yes. But basically, you can separate metamorphic with basalt related. But then
yes,
to identify that this is from Australia or this is from somewhere else, based on the inclusion,
No, I exactly, I agree. But I think Justin was, can you separate from metamorphic corundums was the question.
Yeah.
There is a question that I'm changing a little bit the subject. Can you tell us a little bit about, okay, we saw the rise where the Thai discovered heat treatment, they came in Australia and they started to buy. So you had a huge industry that started. Can you tell us about 1997 when everything stopped? Like, we are living a kind of disaster period. And it's very interesting for me to see, at the end of the 90s with the Asian crisis and then the discovery of the sapphire deposit in Africa, the collapse of this mining industry in Australia, and how, thanks to you, I was able to travel with you. Some of the miners, some of the people there, like Jack Wilson, like others, were on how you can be still a successful sapphire miner now in Australia.
Okay, firstly, why the drastic reduction in the number of sapphire mines in Australia over the period from about 1984, 85 through, from then it just decreased rapidly. I might add the scale of mining before that period, particularly in the 60s to 70s, almost up till 75, was enormous. I mean, we had probably 40 or 50 mines in Inverell, Beninus area alone, all of which were probably processing somewhere around a minimum of 100 to 200 cubic metres a day, and some of them doing that 100 cubic metres in an hour. So, and then on top of that, in the Queensland fields, you had hundreds of miners, underground miners, pick and shovel miners and so forth. So all that died. The question you're asking as to how did the few remaining continue is a very good question. The reason why it died is the Australian sapphire was literally hit by the perfect storm. Firstly, the sapphire from Sri Lanka that came with the heat treatment of Gura meant that there was a lot more sapphire available in the marketplace of a much finer quality than Australian. It diverted the Thais from the Australian market because they could make better money out of the Ceylon sapphire and easier money. And it was a lovely product, a better quality product, quality product. Then there was some economic crises. Also, there were severe problems in Australia with such things as drought affecting the mining operations, and more particularly
because you need water to wash. You need water to wash the ground.
And there was tighter and tighter and tighter mining regulations being imposed on miners here in Australia. So all this happened to make things very, very difficult. So I'll pick three right now successful miners. First is Jack Wilson, and he is still in Inverell, in this area, mining large quantities.
A photo of you and Jack. I will share the photo. Share my screen.
That's not Jack.
That's Jack.
Now, Jack did something a little bit different to everybody else. He looked overseas to find markets overseas and to cut stone. And he's been very successful to be able to keep going, but everybody else has had to stop. And he now has cutting operations in Thailand and marketing operations, some markets that others haven't really explored greatly, and in particular, I think Russia.
Yeah.
So Jack's still managing these days to be able to process his own production and sell it on as cut stone. I don't know whether he sells any rough at all or not. I don't think he does.
So he went vertical. Basically, he traveled to Thailand, and the Thais were not coming anymore. So he went there and he found a partner and he went vertical.
Yes, and not an easy thing to do. And Jack had also been involved with the sapphire mines of Laos after the Jeffersons finished there, and that was a bit of a disaster, but he had a Chinese partner, and that, I think, sort of helped Jack get into the more of the international feeling for the...
I think he went everywhere, because I remember when we had a discussion, I was amazed by his knowledge about all the different basalt-related sapphire, because if I remember well, Jack Wilson went also to work in Nigeria. He went to work in Pailin. He knew Laos. He knew Madagascar. But I think as a miner, it was quite incredible, because I was thinking first, he was a miner in Australia and he was basically staying in Australia and he didn't travel at all. But he had a very, very good knowledge, practical knowledge of most of the basalt-related deposits around the world.
And that, I think, is exactly why he's in the position he is today, because very few, if any, of the other miners really took the effort to go out and find out what was going on in the big wide world. They all concentrated on mining, and that in itself is a big job. Concentrate on mining, and when they had their rough, of course, everybody, the first thing was, if we cut it and sell it to the jewellery stores, we'll make more money. But of course, that's not feasible. But every miner had a go at it, tried it. I know Dominion Mining tried it. We started the factory in Bangkok for that very purpose. But, and Tom Noonan started a cutting factory in Sri Lanka, which I fortunately got stuck in and managed for 2 years. Everybody tried it, but Jack managed to succeed in looking outwards and vertical integration, I should say. The other guy that I can talk about, and a completely different successful miner for a completely different reason, is Peter Brown from Rubyvale. Have you got a photo of him handy by any chance?
Yeah, I have a photo of Peter Brown.
Yep.
That's the man. something that
Yeah,
Justin will get. Peter is that's Peter, like the end type of product for Peter, because I have some other photograph of Peter, which is this one. There are two Peters. There are Peter is. Remember last week, Justin, we were speaking with Chris, and we said there are very few people in the world who are doing from mining to retailing.
Yeah.
And basically, Chris said, "Oh, I know two other guys," and Peter is one of the two other guys, and he is doing mining in Anaki, and he's going to do everything until the faceted stone. And he has a retail shop, so he mines the stone, he cuts the stone, and then he puts the stone on jewelry and he sells them.
Wow, that's a lot of work for one team.
Yeah, so Peter started with nothing in the sapphire field. He came in with as somebody once said, with the arse out of his pants. But he is a brilliant guy, and as Vincent just said, mines the stone himself, cuts the stones himself, and he doesn't do it in a half-hearted manner. His mining effort really clever, and as Vincent pointed out when we were there, it could be adapted to a lot of mining areas around the world very simply. Not so much the digging machines.
This photo, he adapted a machine that is used for opal mining. He adapted that to sapphire mining. So he's digging underground. His mine is underground in Anaki. He's digging, and then it's a single mine operation. He's running the whole mine by himself. And then he has a machine like that. That's his machine, where he's underground here, and he brings the bucket. This is the bucket of ground that is going down here, and then go on the belt, and then go on the jig, and then at the end he gets the stone. But this is a complete single man operation, from digging to collecting the sapphire at the end. And it's just incredible how one man can master all the skills, from mining to cutting, polishing, and then basically retailing with his wife. It's not a one-man operation.
What I find also, if we can go back to that first photograph that you had, Vincent, Justin will find it's interesting, as will any lapidaries around the place.
No, not lapidary. Okay, I'll remove that one. The lapidary is that one. Yeah.
This one. If you have a look on the table, you'll see a diagram of a cut.
Yeah.
So Peter doesn't just cut stones. He very, very carefully plans his cut and so forth, and does a brilliant job. Completely unusual for a miner, not completely unusual, but unusual for a miner to cut sapphires or cut gemstones, but especially so to do a very, very good and careful job. And then on top of that, this is one of Peter's stones that he cut. Then on top of that, he has taken advantage of the tourist trade in the Queensland sapphire fields. And now, essentially, the Queensland sapphire fields, to all intents and purposes, are more of a tourist attraction than they are a mining locality. There are several hand miners, part-time hand miners there. There is only 2 full-time mechanical miners there, and one of them which I will tell you about in a moment. And people like Peter. And just as an aside, I'm sure people will enjoy this little story. Peter has the Ruby Vale Gem Gallery up at Anaki, and they had a cafe there that was let out to some people, wasn't doing very well. But Peter's health is not so good these days, so he's got his 2 sons working with him now, and they're taking over the cafe. And apart from running the sapphire business and so forth, they're also now putting in a boutique brewery to have special sapphire beers produced on site. So you got to hand it to Peter. He goes right through everything. Very clever man.
Yeah.
You have to return there. But, again with Peter, it's the same as Jack Wilson. He survived because, he got a deeper knowledge about sapphire mining. He learned how to cut and to cut very well. And he learned how to master the skill at really professional level from all the chain.
Yep.
And this is the reason why he survived.
And interestingly enough, now one of his main outlets, of course, is online selling. The other successful miner that is a bit of a hidden mystery, actually. We visited his mine with Vincent, is Daryl Mosley.
Yeah. That's an interesting.
Daryl's a little bit of an unknown quantity. He keeps himself very much to himself. He doesn't say much to anybody. The rumour has it around there that he doesn't ever sell his sapphire rough. I don't know whether he does or not. I presume he does, but I have no idea who buys it. But if continuing mining on a large scale that he does is any indication, he's obviously successful. So he's sort of like the Jack Wilson of the Anarchy sapphire fields.
Except that his mine is bigger. The machine he has, the truck, bigger than the wheels of the truck are just bigger than our cars. You have this huge truck and this huge washing plant. That mine, I was so surprised because that was one of the biggest mines I have seen in the world. I was prepared. I was prepared about, the type of mining like Jack Wilson, which was quite impressive. But when we went to that mine, that is kind of not very well known, I was so surprised. The machines are just huge. Everything is huge, and the guy is doing that like a low profile. But this is probably the largest sapphire mine I ever visited, except if you take, SAP in a Kanchanaburi. But even an SAP, the truck were not like that.
Yeah. Anyway, those are my three. There is pretty much the only three successful sapphire miners now in Australia at present.
But I think Daryl is doing. He told me that he was doing something that some of the successful guys I know in Africa were doing. He has a sapphire mine, and he has also a farm. So he has two legs in his business. So he has a very big farm. So when mining is not so good, he moves his stuff into farming, and then he returns to mining, depending on the price, on the situation, and things like that. But both, from what I know, both Peter and Daryl, there is one key thing that makes them successful, in my understanding, is they are not only very knowledgeable about what they are doing, but all their staff, the guys who are driving the equipment and things like that, they are all 30 or 40 years of experience doing that job. So it's not just, a guy who is coming to mine. Is that everybody from the excavator driver, the truck driver, the dump truck, everybody knows perfectly at the highest level of qualification about their job. The excavator driver knows when he's collecting ground in which there are sapphire, because he's digging this type of ground for 30 years. And he knows that, this bucket has sapphire, this bucket don't have. So they know perfectly how to optimize the machine, how to make the flow of the general ground, perfectly smooth in the plant. So everything is optimized from the digging to the end. And if you, from what I see, if you try to go in Australia and you take a random truck driver and a random excavator driver, and you think that you are going to be successful as mining sapphire in Australia, I think you're dreaming, because you just need to have everybody in the company at top level. And Peter is at top level at everything, but Daryl and Jack Wilson, from what I see, all their staff, we discuss with their staff, which is easy in Australia because they speak English. They are all, there is nobody with less than 20 years of experience there.
Well, that's right. That's the other common factor that all three of them, I don't know when Daryl started, but I know he's been around for a long time. But I know Jack and Peter have been there for, well, put it this way, there's been a lot of sapphire miners come and go since they started.
So, Vincent, you've been there now twice with Terry, with a couple of different groups. As an outsider and also as somebody who's been to mines all over the world, what are some of the really impressive things that you've noticed about the Australian industry and the Australian sapphires themselves?
Well, this is exactly what I was speaking about. What was really the most impressive thing for me is the knowledge they have. When I spent like 20 days with Terry in the car, and Terry was telling me all these stories. And then I met Jack Wilson, I met Daryl, I met Peter Brown, I met, Chris Wood at the end. And I found out that, if you want to learn about ruby, you go to Burma. And I can tell you the Burmese, they know about ruby. But if you want to know about sapphire, about mining, about everything, you have to go to Australia. Because this is where, where the jigs that you see everywhere in Thailand, in Burma, in Australia, the machine, where this machine were developed. When you go to Australia and you see the machines they are using in mining, it's unbelievable. They have in Inverell, they have, companies who are, serious mining. You have a workshop, you have a culture, not just about the stone, but you have a culture also about the equipment. They know how to maintain the equipment. They know how to optimize the equipment to make the equipment optimized to the type of ground that you are going to mine. So the guys are really top skills at every level of what they are doing. And for me, before I was thinking, well, I've been to Burma, I've been to Thailand, I've been to Sri Lanka, sapphire, I know, I have seen quite a lot. Then I went to Australia and I said, well, suddenly I realized that, I didn't know that much actually. And that trip with Terry in 2012 was one of the most educative trips, and I was super impressed with what Richard Hughes told me that. Vincent, you have to go to Australia. As long as you don't have been to Australia, there is, you don't have seen basically the face of God regarding sapphire mining. No, that's true. If you want to grade sapphire mining, you have to see the top. And when you see the top, you know how to grade the rest. And from what I know, the top of sapphire mining, you see that when you go to Australia and you meet people like Jack Wilson or Daryl, and you see how they mine and their understanding and how they survive the crisis, the 1990 crisis, and how they were able to succeed and still be alive and still be working. And they will probably continue working for a while because Jack Wilson, his son, is in the business also, and there will be something. But this was probably the most impressive thing that I have seen in Australia. Is I understood that in time of crisis, you have to learn.
Yeah.
You have to learn. You have to go beyond your comfort zone, and you have to learn upscale. You have to go to learn new skills, because if you stay where you are, you're gone.
Yep. I guess that's the same with everything in life.
Terry, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
You are also the example, because you started working in Australia and then you went to Thailand and you have seen all these things. And the key point is knowledge.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now
we've
spoken a lot now of the relationship between the Thai industry and the Australian industry. Is there any crossover between Australia and Sri Lanka, considering that Sri Lanka has been mining sapphires for so long? Is there any skill exchanges that have happened there, or these are two independent worlds?
They certainly are somewhat independent. There are some interesting crossovers. The biggest Sri Lankan community outside Sri Lanka is in Melbourne, Australia. And
actually,
I first went to Sri Lanka because of that very reason. Okay. Sorry, do you want to say something?
No, I just wanted to say one thing. The first time I went to Sri Lanka, in 2005, I was invited by a friend, Armil Samoon, who was and I arrived in Sri Lanka. And at this time, he was organizing a visit for the Australian Geological Association. And you had about 60 or 70 Australians who were, I ended up in a conference full of Australians who went to visit, the mine and the trade in Australia, because one of his cousins of the Samoon family basically was the president of the Australian Geological Association. And it was full of Australians.
Yeah, well,
this is where I met
story, but yeah. Armil is in fact the son of Naji, who we talked about earlier. Anyway, I first went there on a very similar thing to what you're talking about, but way before the heat treatment of Gouda. And that was as representatives of some mining companies here. The Sri Lankan government had a scheme called the Mahaweli scheme, and that was going to flood a series of dams. They were going to flood large areas that are known to have sapphire. So they were seeking tenders from outside companies to mine the sapphires there. And we went over, and that's we knew Naji and his group then. We went over and looked at various areas and put in some proposals and spent a lot of time and money doing it. And then the government changed their minds and said no, they wouldn't allow any mechanical mining. And the reason being that the gem traders got together in Sri Lanka and said, no way, we don't want foreigners coming in here and with large-scale mining. Interestingly enough, I think even now, but certainly up to very recently, there was no large-scale mechanical mining allowed in Sri Lanka at all. So there wasn't any great crossover of our equipment to Sri Lanka. But that being said, the other thing that we did, or Tom Noonan did, was to start a cutting factory in Sri Lanka of Australian sapphire. That's purely all we carried. It was a bit of a failure, but we did have some 160 people working there at one stage, and all we were doing is cutting rounds, calibrated rounds, 3 millimetre and down in calibrated sizes. So there's those sort of crossovers. But the only other crossover I can think of is way back in the days of the Gem Corporation. The boss of the Gem Corporation in Sri Lanka was a chap named Punchi Abahami. And he was terrified of what was happening with these Thai buyers coming in and buying the rough. They had very little or no idea of why they were buying it. They didn't want it to happen. And he actually approached me directly and asked, could I advise the Gem Corporation on the aspects of dealing with Thai buyers from our experience in Australia, which I did. So that's about the only crossovers I can think of.
Yeah. It's such a small world when we get into the gem trade. Like I know at the beginning of this conversation, Vincent was talking about riding across Australia in the car with you and nothing else to do but tell stories. And I had a similar situation in Sri Lanka, riding across Sri Lanka with our mill and him telling me, probably the other side of the world's stories of the stories you're telling us now with, the Naji finding out about how the Geuda was getting treated before anyone else in Sri Lanka, and then him driving around Sri Lanka, buying all the Geuda he could. And at the same time, probably the same month or whatever, Australia is finding out about, or you're specifically finding out about Geuda getting treated and throwing a couple pieces into your heat treatment when you were doing Australian stuff. It's, just so funny when you start to get into people's stories and then they actually all are getting connected. I guess we all just know the same few people and they're all having a big influence in the gem trade around the world.
It's even funnier than that because it was actually Bill Jewell and myself that told Naji about the Geuda treatment. Okay. Why were the Thais suddenly wanting this stuff?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, everything's connected here.
It's a small world, yes. And that's the most wonderful thing about the gem industry, in my opinion.
At this time, at this time, I think Naji was in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong, it was not Bangkok, the hub of the gem trade in Asia, it was Hong Kong. And Naji was there, and I think Bill Jewell was there, and you were there. And then you bring the first furnace to Sri Lanka, correct?
Yeah, Naji had an office in Hong Kong, I believe. I didn't have anything much to do with that. When we went and looked for areas to mine in the Mahabeli scheme, Naji arranged for us, along with a few of his mates, to drive us around looking at the various deposits. Naji was originally a friend of Bill Jewell's, and it was through Bill Jewell that I first met Naji. But that was a long time ago. I remember literally holding Arnold's hand and taking him to school because his parents, for some reason, had something on and they asked me if I'd take him to school. Getting too old, I'm afraid.
No, it's good though. We need to know these kinds of things because a lot of the stuff's never been documented. I know. I spent that afternoon with our mill in the car, and then we just got into such a crazy conversation. And then he was like, "You must meet my father." He drove me and Victoria directly to his dad's house, and then we sat with Naji for 2 hours with the audio recorder, and me just asking him, because I of course was asking him about how the cutting industry was going in the 60s and 70s and stuff. How did these new machines come into into Sri Lanka? But I'm sure I'll have to come and do the same thing with you, and just especially since you started the story saying you started as a gem cutter in the 60s. I don't know anything about the story of Australia right now for gem cutting, but this is on my list of things to do. So hopefully if I get to come out in September, if I get to come and see you, we'll have to sit down and just say, okay, starting in 1967, what happened with the cutting world? Because I know, anytime you've got mining going on in a country, there's always some small part of the industry, at least, who are doing the cutting of those stones. And if you were there in the 60s, starting with cutting, then I'm sure you have some good knowledge that nobody else has written down yet for what's happening there, which is kind of a different topic, maybe.
Sure, but if you include diamonds and what you're talking about,
yeah,
there's actually a book written about the diamond cutting industry in Australia way back in the 20s and 30s.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. I wonder, just as a random question in my head, have you ever come across any really old Australian stones? Like, you were showing us those pictures of the turn of the century, people buying Australian sapphires. Have you ever actually come across any old cut, like, early 1900s sapphires that have been faceted back then?
Well, you wouldn't know really whether you had or not. Yeah. I haven't really looked out for no. We did buy a little stone recently, actually, at an auction that obviously been cut probably way before the Thai cutting was being conducted, but no.
Justin, the son of Peter Brown, who is you have to meet Peter. Sure, yeah, that's the problem. If we take you one day, he's dead. The day is dead. Sorry, I interrupt, but I just saw coming.
No, you're breaking up. We didn't hear that anyway.
So Terry, I got a couple more questions from the audience. If we can go back to the topic of heat treatment, Kim Wallace Wells had asked, do you, when you were doing the heat treatment, did you notice, or I guess when did you first notice the sort of odd yellow color coming out when you didn't put any yellow stones in? Or I don't know if that did happen.
I think what Kim's referring to is, well, maybe not, but a peculiar thing happened in the early days when we were treating. We used to cook the yellows and greens and so forth to make them clearer and brighter. And occasionally, for some inexplicable reason, some would come up as strong golds or even orange colours. But the other thing that came up was white. Some stones turned out to be sort of like white porcelain looking, totally opaque and so forth. And it took a while to find out and to realise that this was chrysoberyl.
Mm.
And chrysoberyl in the rough looks, in our fields, is very, very unusual, quite rare, and looks very similar to a sapphire. In fact, it's almost impossible to, unless you're looking for them, to even recognise. Once you've seen a few, you start to see that the yellow colour of the chrysoberyl is a little different to the sapphire colour. But this then turned out to be a little bit interesting when they started doing the beryllium treatment of sapphire. Because the first question was, where does the beryllium come from? And one of the theories, quite likely, is that it comes from chrysoberyl, mainly perhaps from the deposits of Tanzania, Tunduru, where they get a lot of chrysoberyl. So the Thais were getting a lot of chrysoberyl in their mix of corundum. And there's some associations there of, it's a bit too complex to talk about. But anyway, the initial person that was doing the Songea stone with beryllium and creating the oranges and so forth, he had an associate. He was buying his rough from a company in Canterbury who, had plenty of material coming from Tunduru. And I was one of the first people ever buy any of this stuff accidentally, because I used to like buying this Songea ruby. Was ideal for the Australian market. It was cheap, but it was dark red and so forth. He comes up with this stuff. And I actually started to wonder about where the beryllium was coming from. And then I thought back to the chrysoberyl, and why did we get these odd stones that came up orange and orange and orange red in those days? And the thought occurred to us that it might be that the beryllium, Dick Hughes himself and John Emmett thought perhaps there might be the beryllium coming from the chrysoberyl.
That's the way, I met the guy who discovered the beryllium treatment, and he told me that at this time he was he was working with someone, and so he was going to Sri Lanka and he was buying yellow sapphire from Sri Lanka and Tunduru, basically yellow sapphire. But as you said, it's quite difficult to separate yellow sapphire with chrysoberyl in the rough. And he found out when he was doing the heat treatment that sometimes he had better results when there was chrysoberyl that was mixed with sapphire. So he discovered that when you do the preheating at about 1001, then chrysoberyl start to melt. So you can identify chrysoberyl. The best way to identify chrysoberyl in a parcel with sapphire is to do what we call a warming. So you warm the stone up to 1001, and then you can separate, based on the melted surface, you can separate all the chrysoberyl with the sapphire. At the beginning, he was not doing that. He was doing the heating right away. And sometimes the result was great, sometimes the result was not so great. And then he found out that the result was great because he was heating sapphire with chrysoberyl. Then he had a system. He was all the time putting in his crucible. He was putting chrysoberyl mixed with sapphire in order to have better results. And he was doing that. He told me that he was doing that since around 1994. So basically, around the time that the material from Tunduru started to come, in Sri Lanka and was mixed with the rest. And he told me, I'm doing this technique. That was his secret from 1994 to 2001. And then when he started the technique with the material from Ilakak, and this pink material started to get purple colors, then people started to notice that there was something funny. But before that, when he was just doing that on yellow sapphire, nobody noticed. And for him, it was just, a more efficient way to do heat treatment of yellow sapphire. But he told me, I have heated kilos of yellow sapphire with beryllium, basically with chrysoberyl since 1994. And then the beryllium big story, break out in 2000. And this is exactly the same as what you say, that I remember you told me that in the old days sometime, there were some stones that were looking great and you had no idea why. What was the difference in the...
Exactly. I think that also reflects the whole thing about heat treatment and why Thailand's been so successful. Because people have been... I just saw that there's a message from Mitch Brown. That's Peter Brown's son. He must be watching it. So good day, Mitch. The interesting thing to me about heat treatment generally and why it was so successful in Thailand is because, starting with the Australian sapphire, different guys in Chantaburi and in Bangkok would start to focus on certain types of stones. So this guy may be better at doing dark blue. This guy may be better at doing silky, this guy. And slowly this has progressed. And then, of course, when the Gouda came along and then sapphire from all that. So all the time you've had this huge laboratory of people experimenting. And the Thais are very, very good at experimenting. They'll have a go. They'll try. They're gamblers. Why not try this? Why not try that? And that's how it's all developed and how it's developed there and not perhaps why it's developed anywhere else in the world. And, I think it's amazing. And it's still going on. Just in the last 2 years, we've come to know about, and I had heard of it many years back, we've come to know about temperatures of even 400 degrees centigrade having an effect on certain sorts of sapphire, and treatments of very low temperature, or treatments of very, very long periods of time. Some treatments go on for 6 or 8 months. So it's still developing. It's quite amazing.
Well, heat treatment is basically, it's not just about temperature, it's about 3 factors. It's about temperature, okay? It's about atmosphere, oxidizing, reducing, and it's about time. So basically, you can get the same result at a lower temperature, but if you increase the time. Now, the advantage of that is, for example, you can get a stone, you heat a stone at 1006 for maybe 10 minutes. Or you heat a stone at maybe 600 degrees for 20 days. On some aspect, you will have the same result, except that if you heat at 600 degrees for 20 days, if there is an inclusion that is supposed to melt at 700, it will not melt. Yes. So you can have the same results as 1006 in 10 minutes, except that if you do 1006 in 10 minutes, if there is an inclusion that melts at 700, the inclusion will melt. So there are ways, there are some burners who know that, for example, lab will identify heat treatment based on the aspect of the inclusion. So they say, okay, let's heat at lower temperature, so the inclusion will not be affected, but we just heat longer. So, we heat a stone, but nobody can identify the stone as heated. So then the stone is going out with a report like no indication of heat treatment.
Yep, and I'll take it one step further. For a start, you said 3 parameters. There's a 4th parameter, that's pressure. And there quite recently, people have been doing some treatment processes using pressure. But let's go back to those sapphires that have been picked up 30 or 40 kilometres down the Earth's crust, perhaps, and brought to the surface. It's heat and pressure and time and atmosphere. Because when those things get popped out at the volcano, if they're coming out in the pyroclastics, they're suddenly being cooled fairly rapidly and they're hitting an oxygen-rich environment. If they come out in the magma and the basalt, they are less likely to cool rapidly, more likely to cool slowly within the magma, in the lava flow, and they're also protected from oxygen. So if you talk to the sapphire miners and people around the place, and particularly a guy that I know who's a geologist on the Kings Plains deposit, which he believes, Simon Pecco is his name, we believe is a pyroclastic, essentially a pyroclastic deposit. The sapphire, where you've got pyroclastic deposits, tends to be overall slightly greener and slightly more fractured in shards than the sapphire that you get from areas where we believe are shedding from the erosion of basalts. So you're getting natural heat treatment processes happening even before mankind gets their hands on the stones. And we don't quite know what those processes cause and do.
Well, is it,
Never will. Can't tell before and after, can we?
Is it, basically with pyroclastics, you have, basically, I don't know what was the pressure with the sapphire was, in the magma, that is an interesting thing. Then when you go out of the surface, if you go in a pyroclastic, the pressure will drop quickly, and then the temperature will drop much quicker than in the basalt, where the temperature will cool down slower and slower. So maybe that's why, if the temperature drop quickly, maybe that's why the stone crack, and maybe there is a difference in color. For example, in Pailin, most of the stones are small. They are very blue. There is nearly no yellow or green. And Pailin is mainly basalt. I have never seen a sapphire in pyroclastic in Pailin. Now, you go to Chantaburi, to Benkacha. Benkacha, it's mainly in pyroclastic. There are around Kauplowen volcano, you have I have seen some sapphire in basalt, black star sapphire in basalt, but it seems that in Benkacha, when you look at the thing, it's mainly pyroclastic. So it's possible that there is actually a difference between the material that is going out from a type of volcanic eruption, and mainly pyroclastic, sapphire coming from pyroclastic ashes, compared to the sapphires that are coming from basalt.
Yeah.
There is possibly, something to the other. The difficulty is to identify, because the same volcano may have 5 or 6 or 7 volcanic events, maybe 4 where you will have sapphire in basalt and 2 where you have sapphire in pyroclastic. So it's kind of difficult to find out if that sapphire came out from basalt or that sapphire came out from pyroclastic.
Sure, and not only that
would be a fascinating subject to study, for a geologist.
Well, the lava plain sapphire fields are really fascinating, because there we are finding, without a shadow of a doubt, sapphire in pyroclastic deposits as they fell to the ground, so to speak, in lahars or flows. And interestingly enough, the colour from that particular mine is very pretty blue, very much comparable with Pailin, and small too, again. But yeah, who knows?
But Pailin is basalt. Pailin is basalt.
Oh, it could well be. I'm not saying it isn't, but I'm saying that we do get fine quality, very fine quality blue sapphires, actually directly from the pyroclastic deposits. And these stones, these colours are quite exceptional as far as Australian sapphire. So better than anything else. The best of them is better than anything else you get in Australia.
So I think I have one last question that's a good way to end this wonderful talk that we've just had. So Terry, this is from this is from Alan Marshall, who has already asked a bunch of nice questions on this chat, but he says, what advice would you give to somebody who's a novice that's trying to enter the world of the gemstones? Because he said he's currently an ICU nurse, wants to become a gem cutter. He wants to come into the trade. So in 2020, in the time of coronavirus and everything else, what advice would you give to somebody who is not in the trade but wants to come in professionally?
In the gem trade or the jewelry trade? Gem trade.
Let's say the gem trade, because he's talking about cutting.
Do what I did, and I think what Vincent did, and join a gemological association and do a gemology diploma. Because I know here in Australia and in many parts of the world, by doing that, most of the associations, or all of them, I'm pretty sure, allow, for want of a better expression, non-trade people to do the course. And the other people doing the course are often in the trade, and your lecturers and so forth have some associations with the gem industry. So it's the perfect place to meet people in the industry. And a lot of, here in Australia, and I can only talk about Australian situation. A lot of jobs that come up in the gem industry, even in the jewellery industry, pass through the Gemological Association members to anybody up there interested. So that's what I'd recommend, very definitely.
Yeah.
Join the Gemological Association.
Yeah, I think get a gemology diploma is the first good thing. And if you want to be a trader, learn how to cut. The two things I think you have to do. Number one, gemology, because it's better to have an understanding about just in the talks that you had with a few days ago. And it's better to start studying gemology because you will learn about dichroism, you will learn about several things, and then learning how to cut. Because when you are a cutter, if you have already some knowledge about gemology, you will basically your skill will increase much better because you will understand the type of material and what is a single refractive stone, what is a double refractive stone, and the C-axis and everything. So I think that will be the two advice that I will give to anybody who want to join the industry. Study gemology and learn how to cut.
Yeah.
That's what I did. I did that at the same time in Burma. I spent 4 months studying gemology in the morning and cutting in the afternoon. And like Terry, I was bad at cutting. I don't have the patience you have, Justin, or Victoria has. But I spent this 4 months learning about cutting. That was super interesting because thanks to that, I understood more about rough. And when you study gemology in a gemological school, there is two main problems about studying gemology in a gemological school. Is at one point I was wondering if I was studying junkology or gemology, because in gemology schools they don't have any good stone. You will never see a valuable stone, anything good in a gemological school because they don't have the money to have that and to provide that to the student.
Yeah.
So you will only see, it's easy to make the difference between natural and synthetic because the natural stone or the small stones that are very included on the synthetic one or the big ones that are clean. So it's very easy in a gemological school. Now you have to prove it, which is a little bit more challenging. But when you finish with your gemological diploma and you reach, a business area, you will have synthetic or natural stone that looks exactly the same, big and clean.
Yeah.
And if you don't know how to make the difference, you will be in a big, big trouble, especially if you are in the middle of the jungle in Madagascar and you have to make the decision on the spot. And close to the mine, you have many synthetic and you have many treated stones that people bring in order to eliminate competition. So studying gemology is something important and learn how to cut.
Yeah. And I think both of those things also help, as Terry was saying, expand your network, introduce you to people in the trade, which is exactly what happened to me. And that's why I met you. I learned to cut. I did GIA. And because of that, I met Vincent. And 5 years later, we're doing talks here with Terry in Australia. So it's good. It's a good, I feel like that's a pretty proven path for all of us. So no, I think that's...
I will say, learn gemology, learn how to cut and find a job.
Yeah.
This is what
that's the hard part.
What you did, because then when you find a job, you find a boss. So you learn things you will learn something from that job, and you will still be around and have more occasion to meet the right people. And after a while, with some experience, you will get enough knowledge, network, and experience in order to maybe start your own business. But most of the people I have seen who study gemology and who start their business right away after that, they died. They got burned. They made a mistake, and many of them never recovered from that mistake. So it's better for the first maybe 3, 4, 5 years. Terry, what do you think about that? First, you get a job, and you work with somebody who teach you a bit the basic about the business.
Sure. It's like any profession, I guess. There's no easy, quick route to it. You just have to get the experience before you start putting your own money on the table, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's been about 3 hours. Shall we call it a day? I think that was a pretty good chat we just had. So thanks to Terry for being here. Let me put up our final thank you slide, and just thanks to the audience for hanging out with us. And
4 hours.
Oh,
4
gosh.
hours. It's a long time. Yeah.
Really, You're
3
the-
hours. 3 hours.
3 hours.
breaking the record.
Yeah, 3 hours. Okay, so yeah, if you want to follow Terry, we've got his info up here. Oh, I didn't put the website. Yeah, okay, whatever. But Vincent, me, if you're not following us, you should, because we're posting stuff all the time. And as Vincent has just told me, next week we're going to be talking to Gary Bowersox about Afghanistan and his gems. So that should be fun. I know that I've always wanted to read his book, so I'm looking forward to learning more about this mysterious gentleman. So, but yeah,
That will be an interesting talk, because Gary is what Terry is for Australia. You know, Gary knows. He's a guy who knows about the Afghanistan and his industry for many years. So I think it will be a fascinating talk to next week.
cool. And next week is also going to be an early one. It's going to be the same time as this week.
Yeah, because Gary actually is in Hawaii. So we have to be nice with Hawaii people and with people, you know, in the Pacific. So it will be same time as today.
Okay.
Yeah. Which will be 5 p.m. for him in Hawaii. So it's okay.
Okay.
10 a.m., 9 a.m. for us in Bangkok, 5 p.m. for him in Hawaii. So it's okay. Again, it's very bad for people in Europe, but you know, they will be able to see to watch the talk later on YouTube if they want.
Okay.
So it's okay.
Perfect.
Not to die.
So Terry, thank you so much for your time, your info, your knowledge.
Terry,
Thank
thanks
you
a
for
lot.
having me.
It was exactly like you know, when we were driving together to go from Sydney to Inverell and then to Queensland and things like that. It was just a pleasure to listen to you and your insight on your stories about your 50 years experience in the 57 years experience in the sapphire trade in Australia. Super educative. And I hope that we will do that once again when this crazy time will be gone. We'll be able to take again a good ride from Sydney to all the north and then back to Sydney. That will be great. We can discuss a bit more.
I look forward to having both of you guys back here in Australia. Or if not, I'll say hello next time in Bangkok. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Terry.
Okay.
It was a pleasure.
See you.
Bye-bye.
And thanks to everyone. See you guys next week.